Hello, welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott. We're going verse by verse through the Gospel of John. We have gotten all the way to chapter 5, and we have a great story called The Healing at the Pool on the Sabbath. And that last little phrase, on the Sabbath, is a big key. Sabbath is a word that means rest, has come to mean rest. When we find it in the book of Genesis, where God created everything in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. It's called the Sabbath day. For the Jewish people, the Sabbath day was sundown on Friday, went till sundown on Saturday. Later on, it became, as far as Christians observed it, was on the day Sunday, the actual day of Sunday, which, well, depending on if you were Roman or Jewish, how that time would run. It either start at 6 in the morning or it would start at midnight. But anyway, so the Sabbath and Sunday, we still observe so many Sabbath laws. I remember as a kid, stores were not open on Sunday. Few people worked on Sunday. How life has changed in the period of time of just my own lifespan. But anyway, so we're going to be talking about the Sabbath and what that means. It really means something different than a 24-hour period or a specific day like a Saturday or Sunday. To do so, to insist, let's say, resting on whatever day you think is the Sabbath, that you can't do any work, that is to miss one of the great themes of the Bible. I hope I'll be able to make this clear. All right, let's get into our text here. So we have, there's going to be another healing, and I want to point out that chapters 5 through 10, John starts to present the reasons why Jesus is having conflict with the religious authorities, from 5 to 10. Now, 2/3 of the Gospel of John, 2/3 of the Gospel of John have to do with the last week of Jesus' public ministry and just before he is crucified in the resurrection. So 2/3 so we're in this period where the Apostle John is explaining and presenting how it is that Jesus came into conflict with the religious leaders. And I will say one thing right here. One of the primary reasons was that Jesus went his own way. He did not identify with any of the religious/political parties. Not the Pharisees, who, in my opinion, would have been the far left, nor the Sadducees, the far right, no, the Essenes, those people who went out in the desert, established the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scroll people, or no, the Zealots, nor the Herodians. This was a purely political party where they championed the rule of the Herods, Herod the Great's children and so on, who ruled under the Roman government. So, we start off in chapter 5 with verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, an indefinite period of time has taken place between what we read in chapter 4 and this, the healing of the official's son from a distance. There's a time period that has gone on. Hard to understand what happened, but a feast of the Jews, and it doesn't say what. It's probable that it was one of the feasts, either Purim, which celebrated the deliverance of the Jewish people from the hands of the Persians, from the Persians. Then when they were going to plan to exterminate the Jewish people who had been in exile there. When we find this in the book of Esther, Purim, P-U-R-I-M, or it could have been another Passover. But those are the two feasts that are generally thought. It's interesting that it doesn't tell us which one. For some reason, John did not think it was important to do that. And it says, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now, 3 times we're going to find other Passover times when Jesus goes up to Jerusalem. If I had to put my money on it, I would say this is another Passover, the 4th, and really the first in the Gospel of John. So he goes up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roof colonnades. They're going to take a little explanation here. Okay. The sheep gate, that was so named because it was through the gate, which was in the northern part of the city, where the animals for the sacrifice, the sheep that are led to the slaughter, will be brought in. That's where they came in. The sheep was known as the sheep gate. Notice he says in Aramaic called Bethesda. Now, Bethesda means the house of mercy, the house of mercy. Beth in Hebrew and Aramaic, Beth means house. And so Bethesda would mean a house of mercy. But there is another word that we find in the place of Bethesda in the majority or the majority of the best manuscripts called Bethsaida, Bethzatha, which means the house of the olive tree. My version, the English Standard Version, has Bethesda, but the commentators that I studied, that I always study in preparation for the sermons, I preach these sermons before I do them here, most of them, but I would land on Bethesda, the house of the olive tree. It has the best manuscripts of it. There's about 7,000 extant Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and several thousand other copies of manuscripts of other languages like Coptic and Syriac and Ethiopic, and some of the great translations, many of which are older, far older than some of the best Greek manuscripts. And so, and notice this is one of the areas where there's a little dispute, and what a big deal it is between House of Mercy or House of Olive Tree. Anyway, now there's a pool. It appears to be an artesian pool, and it says it has 5 roof colonnades. Now, what it means is there were 5 places around those pools, and by the way, there were 2 of them. They had been excavated. One was 55 feet long, the other was 60 feet long, and there was even a fresco that was produced later on that pictured an angel stirring the water up. And I tell you this because you'll notice that a verse is missing here in our English translation, which is in the King James. Verse 4 is missing. I'll get to that in a minute. But there were roofs. There were places that provided shelter from the rain, from the heat, the sun. And it was where people were placed. It was a place of mercy. That's probably why Bethesda, there's a Bethesda, Maryland there. And the house of mercy, it means the hospital and so on. So these 5 roof colonnades, they were up on piers, on stone piers. Verse 3 says, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. So this was a place where these people would be, and they would receive alms. The people on their way to the temple would give alms, and this is one of the things how the poor people in Jerusalem at that period were cared for. And then that's verse 3. Then it goes right on to verse 5. Verse 3 is missing. Now I'm going to read it to you. It says, waiting for the moving of the water, for an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. Okay. That is not a part of the book of John. It got added at least several hundred years later, 3 or 4, 500 years later, but it communicated a kind of a fable, a tale that was told about this. This fellow obviously knew about, and at some point, some writer knew of the story and put it into a manuscript, and it got copied and copied and copied, and so it continued, but it's very clear that it's not a part of John's gospel. Now, verse 5 says, one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. 38 years. The average lifespan of a human being in that period was not much longer than that. It's interesting how the ages of which people die has lengthened and lengthened and lengthened. But here it was very close to how long this man had been an invalid. When we don't know what kind of problem he had. We just don't know. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there for a long time, he asked him, do you want to be healed? Now, to make this short, the text, the grammar here indicates that Jesus had asked around. This was not a miracle point of a word of knowledge like we see in other places like the woman of Samaria and so on. But the Greek indicates that Jesus had talked and found out, or somehow knew, maybe had been asked by somebody else, could you possibly go and do something for this poor man? We don't know. But he'd been there a long time, and Jesus said, do you want to be healed? Now, why the question? Wouldn't it be obvious that this guy would want to be healed, but maybe not? Somehow he'd been able to stay there for a long time and survive. He had developed a survival technique. We're going to find out a little bit later. May not have been the most honest person, may have been doing some kind of scam, some kind of pulling some fraud thing. We don't know, but there's indications that might be so. Will come up later. But he says, do you want to be healed? He doesn't say to him, be healed. He says, do you want to be healed? And it may be the guy had to come to the place where he had to be honest with himself. I've developed a fairly comfortable life. I had somebody last night at the prison, San Quentin, say to me, you know, here, we get to eat 3 times a day. The food's not that bad. We have 100% hospital dental care, psychiatric care. We have a place to live. We don't get rained on. We don't get frozen. We don't get baked. We live here. There's all kinds of stuff to do. And a lot of people, I have found, they found that this is not a bad place to be. I'm getting taken care of, and I couldn't get taken care of someplace else. Now, maybe the man had been milking this injury for all these years because he was surviving and getting care. I don't know. By the way, most convicts do not think that way like I just described. Most of them hate it and want to get out of there as quick as they can. But there's the exception, of course. The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me. So here was the tale, the fairy tale that had been told, that this guy had imbibed. Now, it was an artesian spring. Water would come up. It would bubble up. And the water would be stored. And so the fable was handed down generation after generation. And you have to ask yourself, why didn't anybody help him? Why didn't somebody come to his aid and help him get down there? But it was such, his impairment was such, that he couldn't move quick enough, and somebody else was down there, lickety-split, and they just thought, well, that's it. I lost again. I don't know. But it's an indication that this guy was a little bit different than we might think he was. Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, instant healing, unlike the official son that we looked at last week in John 4. But he says, get up, take up your bed and walk. Now the problem is when Jesus said, take up your bed, it's going to cause a lot of problems. If he had just said, take up, get up, and walk, it wouldn't have been a problem. But Jesus spoke this way very directly. I think that the time had come for Jesus to begin to confront the religious authorities. And this is what's going on here. You'll see. Now, around the Sabbath, all kinds of laws were made. Now, we know in the Ten Commandments that we are not, it said, don't work on the Sabbath. Don't work on the Sabbath. As time went on, the rabbinic tradition had developed 39 laws pertaining to things that you were not to do on the Sabbath. And let me tell you, rigidly enforced. Now, the 39th law was that you are not to carry anything like furniture, anything heavy on the Sabbath, except you could carry a bed if someone were on the bed. In other words, somebody needed to be moved, like on a stretcher. So they had these laws, and it was a burden upon the people, all the laws. I am familiar with some of them. My first job I ever had was delivering kosher delis to the ladies on Friday afternoon, making the Sabbath, the Shabbat dinner. I worked for a Jewish delicatessen in Los Angeles, first job I ever had. And so I knew about those laws because I used to be a part of American Zionist Association, and most of my friends were Jewish when I was growing up. And so I knew about all the Sabbath laws. And they were very rigidly enforced here at this time. And he was not to carry the bed, not to do it. But so he was healed, took up his bed, and walked. Verse 8. Now that day was the Sabbath. Here John introduces in a dramatic way, this took place on the Sabbath. Bad news. So that was verse 9. So verse 10 is, so the Jews, now when John again uses the word Jews, he means the religious authorities. John himself is a Jewish man. Jesus is Jewish. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. They could have said, thank God you're healed, man, after all these years. You can have a semblance of an okay life now. There was none of that. There was no thanksgiving. They saw that he was breaking a Sabbath law. They felt obligated to come to that man and chastise him and accuse him of breaking a Sabbath law. Not a simple thing. Okay. Verse 11, but he answered them, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. This man did not know who had healed him. He didn't know who Jesus was. Jesus had just come up to him and said, do you want to be healed? So, and he says, I have nobody to help me get down. He didn't understand. He didn't get the idea that this one that's standing in front of him could heal him like that. He didn't understand. But all of a sudden he was healed. How he knew he was healed, I don't know. Felt it. Felt it somehow. He had life in his limbs. He was able to move. So anyway, he doesn't know who Jesus is. And he just said, a guy said to me, take up your bed and walk. I was healed. I'm going to do what he said. Probably, something like that. Verse 12, they asked him, Who was the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Who's this guy? Now, they're interested in getting him. They want to go after this guy, ordering that the Sabbath be broken. You see, it happens to people. The mere observance of laws and rituals become more important than the well-being of other people. Love for our fellow brothers and sisters is submerged under rule keeping. And let me tell you, that happens so very quickly, very quickly. When I was in the military, I had to work every third Sunday, all week, all day long. I became a Christian after I was in the military for 2 years. I was a medic, and I would work all night long, from 8 to 8. And people would criticize you're working on the Sabbath. You can't be doing that. You have to protest. Well, I never went with that because the Sabbath means something. I'm hoping I can get it. I have to hurry on. Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn as there were a crowd in that place. Jesus didn't want to create a big stir. He wasn't going to stand around and people say, wow, aren't you wonderful? Can you do that for me? Jesus left. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple. Now the man had gone into the temple. Jesus found him there and said to him, see, you are well. You are well. Then he says, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Now, in the Greek it says, stop your sinning. Stop your sinning. Well, Jesus knew that the guy was involved in some kind of sinful behavior. We don't know what it was. We don't know what it was. I almost have thought sometimes that somebody said to Jesus, you know, there's this guy down at the pool of Bethesda, and he is such a problem. He takes advantage of everybody. He steals from everybody. Could you go down there and do something? I don't know. Total speculation on my part. But that's the crazy way I think sometimes. But he goes to him. He finds him, and he says, sin no more. So you wonder why Jesus said that. Maybe the guy's going to continue the same kind of scam or intimidation, whatever it was, that the man had been doing. I don't know. Or it could be, of course, he wants him to be a faithful person. Jesus says, stop doing the sin that you are doing. Jesus knew about the sin. That is the thrust of the Greek. He says, that nothing worse may happen to you. We don't know what that means. The man went away, verse 15. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Thanks a lot. You know, there's two ways you can go with this. The guy was trying to ingratiate himself with the religious leaders. You're going to point out to this is the guy over here. It's this guy Jesus. This is the guy Jesus. They already knew about him. This guy Jesus. Maybe he was doing that. Maybe he was thinking he was doing a good deed. Who knows? Maybe he was trying to get Jesus in trouble. Jesus had said, stop your sinning. Maybe the guy got upset with that. I remember how upset I got when I learned all the things that the Bible said that I was to stop doing. I was offended because I was doing a lot of sin when I became a Christian. A lot of sinning. I was good at sinning, I got to tell you. And it took me a long time even to realize all the crazy stuff that I had just commonly done. I was immersed in all kinds of sin. I was not the wonderful little guy that you think I am today. I'm really still kind of a rascal. But, so verse 16 says, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus. This is the point of the story. The religious authorities had started to persecute Jesus. Why? Because he had encouraged someone to break the 39th law about the Sabbath. He carried a bed on the Sabbath day. He worked. He worked. That's the thing. He worked. You were to do no work on the Sabbath. Remember, the Sabbath means rest. The Sabbath is one of the great themes of Scripture. We find it in the early chapters of Genesis. We find it in the commandments in Exodus chapter 20. We find it in all kinds of places. We find it in the prophets, Jeremiah. I have a quote here from Jeremiah 17:21 says, "Do not bear a burden on the Sabbath." Well, it was a big deal, the Sabbath. Give you the short of it because I've only got 2 minutes left. Jesus is our Sabbath rest. What we do, we rest from our work of trying to save ourselves, and we rest in the finished work of Jesus. I like to say all the religions of the world are work-oriented. What you do, what you think. Christianity is not that way, not even close. Has nothing to do with what we do. Our good deeds have to outweigh our bad deeds. That'll never work. We're all lost. It's resting in the finished work of Jesus. I have to finish. And this is why the Jews were persecuting him, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them. See, they accosted him. It's hard to see in the sentence here, and this is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Now, somehow they had come to Jesus. See, John is he doesn't give us this full picture, which like they had to have found Jesus, come to him, and then Jesus answered them, and he says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." He's working. So the idea of doing no work is not why the Sabbath is in the Scripture. It has to do with our resting in Jesus, our not working. And he's going to say something that is really going to upset them. And we're going to be seeing in the next week, where he says, "My Father." Who is he referring to? Who's referring to the Creator God, God the Father. He says, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." That's why he says he did the healing on the Sabbath so long.